I'd like to thank everybody and welcome everyone for attending this evening. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for taking their time this evening, this afternoon, to share their experiences with us. Before we introduce and get to the panelists, Dr. Bo Dunlay, the Dean of Medical School, would like to address the group. Dr. Dunlay, the floor is yours.
First, I'd like to thank all of our panelists who are appearing this evening. I know it's a leap of faith to participate in this sort of thing, particularly via Zoom, when you can't really see people paying attention to you. To the group as a whole, I'd like you to think about a couple of things as we listen to what the panelists have to say. You know, we're here in the business of producing exceptional physicians, and to be a good doctor, you really have to be a great listener. So I hope that we listen carefully this evening. The other thing about being a great doctor is you have to be empathetic, which means you have to be able to put yourself in other people's shoes. So as we listen to what the panelists have to say this evening, I would hope that people listen with their hearts as well as their ears, because I think there's a lot to be learned this evening about what people's experiences have been. I'm sure that they've been, frankly, very different than mine. So I want to thank all the panelists. And as we go forward from this evening, I want to remind everybody that we are the hand of God at work in the world. And as such, we are called to be instruments of peace. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Jason. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Dr. Dunlay. So our first panelist this evening is Dr. Ron Johnson. Dr. Johnson is professor in the Department of Psychiatry and is the Associate Dean for Diversity and Inclusion. Dr. Johnson.
I want to take a few moments of silence to devote our prayers and thoughts to the family, friends, and victims of both the Atlanta and Colorado killings. Thank you. I want to pause to condemn the hatred and violence that took precious lives of people in Atlanta and Colorado. My comments here tonight are focused on anti-Asian hate and what I assess as racial terrorism. Asians are regularly subjected to ridicule, disdain, abuse that has really resulted in a rise in racial profiling and hate crimes against Asians, Asian Americans, and immigrants. In moments like this, I really struggle with what to say, other than my heart goes out to everyone struck by this terrible tragedy. I don't really have any answers, not immediately, although the only answer that comes to mind is a simple but strangely difficult one these days, it seems, is that not to hate each other. It just seems that too many times we really struggled to accept our own humanity, to acknowledge that we're a nation of immigrants who might believe different things. I do know what I can do as a result of the various hats that I wear here at Creighton. I'm here at Creighton to help educate, persuade, and use all of the resources available in the School of Medicine and the Office of Diversity and Inclusion to support anyone subjected to hate because of their race, their disability, their gender, their sexual orientation, their transgender status, or their religion. Over 12 months, in the past 12 months, roughly 31% of Asian American people have reported being subjected to slurs and racist jokes. About 26% have feared that someone might threaten or physically attack them. And 58% have believed that anti-Asian racism has increased since the beginning of the pandemic. I'm not Asian, but I immediately become Asian the instant that hate is directed at my Asian brothers and sisters. Racism, misogyny, gun violence, mental illness are unfortunately all included in the Atlanta killings. But this country has a rich tapestry of mass racial terrorism toward Asians. The history now includes the Atlanta killings, and that history is littered with anti-Asian hate. So the Atlanta killings, we could see this coming, and that's what makes it even more painful. We saw things happening. People were warning us. People in the Asian communities have been tweeting. They've been saying things like, please help us. We're getting punched on the streets. We're getting slurs written on our doors. We've seen this happening. Racism against Asian Americans has long been, unfortunately, an ugly part of US history. For example, there was the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. It was essentially designed to prevent Chinese laborers from entering the United States as a result of widespread xenophobia. In 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt issued the Executive Order 9066 that authorized the evacuation of all persons deemed to be a threat to national security from the West Coast to relocation to further inland. At the time, we were at war with Japan, Germany, and Italy. Okay, so we dispossessed property of American citizens under the guise of national security. 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry were forced to relocate to internment camps. Question: how many German and Italian Americans were in internment camps during World War II? And speaking of the Japanese internment, what gets hidden by time are the personal stories behind this racist incident. Most of my friends know that I love the theater. And I went to see a play that was depicting the internment of the Japanese. I sat next to a woman who, during the intermission, related a story about her mother who was a child in one of the internment camps. The floors of these cabins were raised off the floor, and the children were not allowed to play outside, so they would make their own toys and play inside. And two boys were flying paper airplanes they had made, and one of the planes flew under the wall, but was reachable by the boys. And as he extended his arm to retrieve the paper plane from the ground outside, one of the soldiers standing guarding the compound shot the boy in the head. His blood splattered on his friends, and the blood sprayed on the mother of this woman who was telling me this story. Her mother relived that same incident every time before she went to bed for the rest of her life. As a clinical forensic psychologist, I have had the fortune, or I guess you might say the misfortune, of having treated children of Japanese internment survivors. All of them relayed jarring stories. You don't have to be Asian to understand the tendency to lump all Asians into a group or use personal grievance as an excuse for racial terrorism. Non-Asian people in the United States often conflate Asian subgroups. Many people directed their anti-Chinese sentiment toward people of other Asian heritage. In the 1980s, the US auto industry was experiencing a downturn, mostly due to poor management decisions and competition from Japan. There was a lot of Japanese hostility percolating in the country at the time, particularly among Detroit auto workers who were most impacted by this. 2 auto workers killed Vincent Chin. He was 27. They shouted racial invectives toward him before brutally beating him in the head with a baseball bat, to the point that he was unrecognizable. The 2 men supposedly mistook Mr. Chin, who was Chinese American, as Japanese. So if you go back and read the newspaper accounts, and I did that a few days ago, at the time, the suggestion from the media accounts was, had he been Japanese, then somehow these 2 racist assailants would have somehow been justified in their attack on him. Mr. Chin was buried the very day that he was supposed to have been married. His killers were not convicted. So if you're sickened by what graphic descriptions I've just used to characterize racial terrorism, or you're thinking we don't need to dwell on this racial past, then I say, good for you. But please keep your thoughts to yourself, because the eyes of people of color, you're viewed as an apologist for the racists who commit these heinous racial terrorist acts. Because these graphic events have a seamless racist trail that leads us right up to the Atlanta killings. What do many of these incidents have in common? For example, in the Atlanta killings, they're an example of a hate crime. I don't use the term racist very often, but anyone who can't see the incident as a hate crime is either a defender of racial terrorism, a bigot, or both. I say all of this in relation to the Atlanta killings because of the response of the Atlanta Sheriff's Office, which is a textbook example of systemic or structural or institutional racism. Why would I define it as structural racism? Well, the sheriff's spokesperson had a news conference, which he characterized the murderous actions that resulted in 8 people being killed as the murder was having a bad day. This is a textbook example of systemic racism. To no surprise, the same sheriff spokesperson got into trouble for selling racist t-shirts on Facebook. His sales pitch for selling these racist t-shirts was, get them while they last. He encouraged his friends to buy the racist t-shirts with a logo that read something to the effect of COVID-19 imported virus from China. China spelled C-H-Y capital N-A. A new chapter in an old story. What the Atlanta shootings reveal about the United States. Law enforcement is charged with protecting people, use words like having a bad day to excuse multiple murders, and this is an example of systemic racism. When you think about it, words do have consequences. There have been plenty of red lights flashing in the past year. Again, racially charged words used by the Atlanta spokesperson of the shooter. He described the spokesman as the killer as someone who was pretty much fed up with the kind of what was going on in his life. He was at the end of his ropes. And yesterday was a really bad day for him. And this is what he did. I don't have enough profanity to describe my reaction to that. So spare me the excuse that someone who kills 8 people was just having a bad day. Like clockwork, as soon as the news broke, the excuses started. The sheriff's spokesman added that the suspect had assured the authorities that the shootings were not racially motivated. So I guess the police procedure for these days is to take the criminals at their word and repeat their talking points. Whatever you do, please don't try to tell me that this thing had nothing to do with race. You can't disconnect this violence from racial stereotypes that people attach to Asian women. This guy blamed a specific race of people for his problems and then murdered them because of it. If that's not racism, then the word has no meaning. Angela Mayo once said, "Now I know why a caged bird sings." It was her way of conveying how it feels to be exposed to repeated acts of senseless racial terrorism. I stand shoulder to shoulder against anti-Asian hate. Asian Americans have been attacked, scapegoated throughout the pandemic. We've had people in positions of incredible power scapegoating Asian Americans, people with the biggest platforms spreading this kind of hate. Each of my fellow panelists here tonight that follow me will tell stories about their experiences with racism, but also offer hope and ways of moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Our next panelist is Dr. Renuga Vivekanandan. Dr. Vivekanandan is Associate Professor in the Department of Medicine and the leader of the Infectious Disease Group on the Omaha campus. And she is also the Assistant Dean of Accreditation. Renuga, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Johnson. That was really good. And I will share some personal experiences that I have had, starting with when I was very little. So I grew up in Sri Lanka, and I was a minority in the community. So we were prosecuted, targeted, and civil war, and we had to leave because of that. So it started really young. And as a young adult, growing up in North America, I've been called sometimes a lot of names. Some examples would be, look at that monkey, look at that cockroach. So as a young person, it was really hard, and I didn't know how to handle some of those interactions. And what was really helpful was the community that was around me, my family, my friends. And over the years, I've become very strong and resilient. However, nowadays, I think I experience it in a microaggression point of view where it's not very overt. I could give you an example. I'm the infection control director for the hospital. So, there's policies that you have to wear a mask in the hospital for all the visitors that come in. But sometimes when I see a support person in a room, when I remind them, and this has happened over and over again, an example 2 weeks ago when I reminded that because it's a pandemic, you have to wear a mask in a hospital room. a patient's significant other got up, threw the stuff that they had, said, "I don't like you," slammed the door. So I don't think the same experience would have been seen by if somebody who didn't look like me say similar. That's the perception I got at that moment. But again, I think whenever these type of situation come across, what keeps me going is my colleagues, the people around me, and being able to now, how do I navigate through these situations? So takeaway, I always think is there's three things that it's important to think about and how to handle is it's important for myself and others when we go through this, these are real issues. So affirm that these issues are real. And modern day racism exists is important for all of us to kind of acknowledge in different ways. I think it's really, really important to engage with people of other colors and cultures and understand each other so that we can develop empathy and know where we are coming from. And so I think that is really important. So engaging and being with people of other groups and cultures and race. And then I also think seek to become a student. It's really important to continue to learn about others and see how we can be better. Sometimes we don't understand somebody else's plight, where they're coming from. And sometimes we might have a paternalistic view of how to take care of things, but I think it's really important to step back and learn from where they're coming from and have empathy. And I think one of the biggest things that we can do to help each other is listen and be there for each other. So thank you for the opportunity, letting me speak.
Thank you, Renuga. Our next panelist is Dr. Jian Zhao. Dr. Zhao obtained his bachelor's in biomedical engineering at Huazhong University of Science and Technology in Wuhan, China, then came to the US and earned his PhD in physiology from UCSF. After his postdoctoral training, he was a faculty member at St. Jude's Research Hospital for nearly 20 years before coming to Creighton University, where he is currently the chair of the Department of Biomedical Sciences. JZ, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. As a Chinese American, I strongly condemn the Atlantic killings, and this is the hatred crime that we all should be ashamed of, and is very similar to all those happening in Atlanta, in Los Angeles, in San Francisco, in New York, and so on. And this also reminds, I was going to tell the story of Vincent Chin. So I want to add a few words on that because, the two people who killed Vincent was fined for $3,000 and no jail time. And when the judge, put the sentence, and he mentioned that he understands the pain of unemployment. And that was really something that is really not acceptable, and then completely, angered many of the Chinese Americans, and who basically view this $3,000 of a license to kill. And this is really similar kinds of events, very similar to what the George Floyd had experienced, and so on. So what lesson I learned, I think, is that when a society starts to have hate crimes towards one minority group, if others didn't stand up, and they will eventually hurt all the other groups as well. I think this is really the key concept that I learned from this experience. So without standing up to against such a aggression, I think the society would not be all inclusive, would not be civilized, there'll be no democracy. So I think from that angle, I, again, strongly on behalf of all probably the Chinese Americans in Creighton, in my circle, I would strongly condemn this. My personal experience, as Jason mentioned, is that I grew up in China. I came here when I was 21. I live in San Francisco. I live in New York City. I live in Memphis. Now I live in Omaha for almost 35 years. And I also, married a Jewish wife with 2 kids that were raised in the biracial cultures. And I have to say, we have not really experienced that much of the racial, aggressions that I talked about. That. And one of the reasons also is that I believe we had worked in this biomedical research environment where, the Asian Americans are not considered to be a minority. So, I think that, explains some of this. However, have I heard or have I learned of some of the incidences where the racial hatred as well as the aggression had occurred to Chinese Americans or Asian Americans? Yes, I did. I mean, for example, just for the last few years, we had encountered the Trump administrations to selectively targeted a few, mainland Chinese American scientists, accused them of being spies of China, and many of the accusations are false. And one latest example was the Dr. Gan Chen in MIT. And, as you know, MIT supported his complete defense against accusations that he was engaged in the MIT mediated, the bilateral activities. So this kind of accusations are are still ongoing right now. So I think that's one incident. And another instance I really experienced for the last couple of years, or 5 years or so, is to start to realize that there's a so-called glass ceiling. And this phenomena actually start from the fact that there are so many Asian Americans who are working hard and achieve extensively and very successful. However, in the leadership positions, very few are got promoted from the Asian American population. One example is I just checked, Harvard Medical School, for example, all the leaders or the chairs of the basic science department, none of them is an Asian American. And the other 40 or so clinical department chairs have no Asian American either. So I think it's a phenomenon that is quite widespread. And the third one is I personal experience is that one college admission process, they somehow, for example, Harvard admission process had erroneously, used the personality trait as a factor to exclude many of the Asian American applicants. So this is just a few examples of such. However, I also look at it in addition to this such a systemic kind of a racism. I also noticed that in our daily life, as Ranga has mentioned, that there's micro aggression, and those are based on, for example, the implicit bias or unconscious bias in our daily life, and that will give rise to some of the discriminations. So I really feel many of those incidences. I just personally, I want to refresh my, my behavior. Sometimes I also personally, encountered or even committed such a microaggression. For example, in the during the discussions, and some of the people have some accents in English accents, and I sometimes joked about their accents, and many other discussions or something like I sometimes did not cut some people off, did not finish listening to their opinions during discussions. And then in our hearing field, for example, we encounter many of the hearing disabled scientists when we're in the social settings. Sometimes I just repeat it once. If they have hearing disabilities, they're hard to hear. I just say it once and then repeat it maximum once. Sometimes I just walk away rather than patiently talk to them. And this really sometimes I feel is a little bit also very, microaggression or bias unconsciously from my side. I think we need to notice that. And what are the causes of those micro sort of aggressions or general aggression, I think? There are many reasons I've thought about, right? We have a disagreement. We have very strong opinions, and we sometimes run very high temper. And sometimes we just have bad behaviors. And those are the daily behaviors, the daily things that we need to sort of pay attention to. And this kind of a conflict, of course, always exist, and it will exist. And also the conflicts, sometimes occur not only just between the races, but also within each race. And I know in our Chinese culture, there are a lot of, conflicts, right? So I think for all of this, the solution to move forward, as many previous speakers have mentioned, is that we need to stand up against the systemic aggression, and we need to intervene when we notice some of the microaggressions or systemic bias. And we also need to teach ourselves to listen to others. I think only when we all inclusive, only when we become, accepting others, that's when our society will become really diverse and really prosperous. And this is really what I think comes down to the basics of the Jesuits education we call cura personalis, is to care the individual person. So thank you for this opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, JZ. Our next panelist is Dr. Ranga. Dr. Ranga is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry in the School of Medicine on the Omaha campus. Dr. Ranga, the floor is yours.
Much. It's an honor to be with so many this evening, and a privilege to be part of an institution that has authentic conversations about social justice. My own journey has been that of a South Asian woman, an international medical graduate, who moved to the US in 1995 for study in psychiatry. As a family, my husband and I navigated assimilation into this melting pot, acculturation, and we hoped that we were able to guide our son towards a healthy multicultural identity. Meanwhile, I'm so grateful that I found my meaning in medicine in the work of child and adolescent psychiatry, mentoring psychiatry trainings, and again, having these authentic, difficult conversations about what it means to be culturally humble, what is implicit bias and stigma. As I drove to work last week, there was this sense of dread as I listened to the news and thought, yet again, devastating loss of life. 8 people, including women of Asian descent, were shot dead. And I had also come across another article in the Psychiatric Times, reading it, and that used the term coronaciophobia. The pandemic, death, disease, isolation, social unrest, the heaviness, right? So much for us to process this whole year that has passed. My own personal experience, the best word that I could find is invisible. I have felt when I speak up or participate, I could be passed over. And I learned to accept that as, that's the way it is, and not to be reactive. As a psychiatrist, I do a lot of self-talk, and I was able to talk myself out of any reaction to that. I'm a program director, and the well-being of my trainee is the most important to me. That day of the Atlanta killings, I realized I was alerted that one of my trainees was struggling. I want to highlight this narrative. This has been powerfully written by my trainee, and I want to honor her voice. So this is what she says. It is hard to process or describe the thoughts and emotions that run through my mind when I heard about the Atlanta shootings last week. My first reaction was fear for my family members in that area. Even after knowing that they were safe, I couldn't shake the chilling understanding that so many of my loved ones aren't as safe in this world as they should be. I realized that the built-up pressure had become too much. Generations of painful stories washed over me. Stories of hiding religion, evading the Viet Cong, escaping Vietnam. My family's story has been a repetitive one of hiding and running away. Coming to the United States represented opportunity, relief from the repression, freedom of religion. But recently it feels like it's time to hide or run away again. I can't stop asking why. Why did this happen? Why are Asians being yelled at, stabbed, punched, killed? Why did a man shout that I was a Chinese exploitive when I was going out for a walk with my dog? Why did that sting the same as hearing someone yell, "Woohoo, Asian girls," years ago, when I went out for a walk with my little sisters? Too often, we have felt like scapegoats. While it has been a difficult time, it has also been a time that others have shown compassion, support, embracing me and checking on me. It's still hard to identify how I feel because there's so much: concerned, disappointed, betrayed, helpless. At the same time, I have felt supported, resilient. I don't know what the future holds, but I have hope. Moving forward, please keep checking on the Asian American and the Pacific Islanders, the people around you, and calling out racial justices anytime that you may witness them. My hope personally today in participating and talking with all of you was to pass on the message of allyship. I attended the psychiatry training directors retreat a few weeks ago and learned and asked myself how I could be a better ally. Allyship is defined as follows by Nicole Asong Hara, the Director of Diversity at Mayo. When a person of privilege works in solidarity and partnership with a marginalized group of people to help take down the systems that challenge that group's basic rights, equal access, and ability to thrive in our society. So my goal for myself is to be an ally, and I hope that we all can be allies in this process. And the best resource I can share with you all today is a guide to allyship. Just type in that in Google and many, many resources pop up. Once again, thank you very much for allowing me to share my thoughts. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ranga. Our next panelist is Father Jim Clifton. Father Clifton is an assistant professor in the Department of Medical Education in the School of Medicine on the Omaha campus and the Associate Dean of Mission and Identity. Father.
Thanks, Dr. Bartz, and thanks to all. I feel honored to be part of this panel and to listen to the stories. I want to make a few remarks from Creighton's tradition, but I'm mindful that we gathered bring many traditions, and my hope is that we can find an echo in each of our traditions in the moments that I share from Creighton's tradition. I want to use first just a brief passage from one of the most important documents of Catholic tradition from Vatican II. It says this: the joys and the hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of the people of this age, especially those who are poor or are in any way afflicted, these are the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the followers of Christ. Indeed, nothing that is genuinely human fails to find an echo in their hearts. But that doesn't just happen. That echo is not automatic. It must be cultivated. It must be listened to. It must be nurtured and protected and amplified and shared. So one image that I have of us and our call is to be people for whom the human family, in its joys and its griefs, its anguishes and its sorrows, we resonate with those things and we ponder them and reflect upon them and draw wisdom from them, and share them, act upon them, cultivate attitudes, and speak words from what we hear. Second, we're a people that are committed to respecting and reverencing the dignity of each person we encounter. And we talk about that frequently as we look at our patients. But we can't be shallow about that. First of all, it's important to remember the source of that dignity and the nature of that dignity. We believe in the intrinsic dignity of each and every human being. Intrinsic, it's built into their humanity because they are a unique reflection of the image of God. And so it's not just about being nice or being respectful. It's about putting on new eyes, seeing through our hearts and our minds to discover that reflection in each other that we meet, and to reverence the intrinsic dignity of each person that we meet. And if we fail in that, when we fail in that, because we do and we will, but when we fail in that, we are incomplete in our understanding of our own humanity, and we're incomplete in our understanding or seeing the face of God. The third thing is just a reflection upon cura personalis, building upon what Dr. Zhao said. It's not just care for the whole person. It is a passionate dedication to the flourishing of every other person. A passionate dedication to the flourishing of every person. And so when we talk about cura personalis, it's helpful to carry with us that more profound and powerful understanding of what it is. Finally, that common spirit use of the kind of the phrase, hello, human kindness. And Dignity has had that as its guiding image for a long time. It's really helpful for us here because human kindness, it's a reminder that we're kin, that we all are kin. But again, that is not immediately self-evident to our flawed selves and to our poor seeing and to our closed minds and our stony hearts at times. It must be cultivated. It's a commitment. It's to say, I want to be a hello, a welcoming, a recognition of human kindness, of kinship to each person I encounter. We have such wonderful tools from our mission to help us along the way, but most of all, we have each other to be dedicated to drawing each other to greater wholeness in this way. And we have the gift of prayer. It may seem quaint to say this, I hope it doesn't, but that we might each pray urgently every day for the healing of the human family and the making new of the human heart, so that we really see one another as kin. Thanks.
Thank you, Father. Our next panelist is Dr. Jaya Raj. Dr. Raj is Professor of Medicine in the Creighton University School of Medicine and a Residency Program Director at the Creighton Alliance Internal Medicine Program in Phoenix. She also serves as Chair of the Creighton University School of Medicine Diversity and Inclusion Committee on the Phoenix campus and facilitator in the Gender Equity Subgroup of the School of Medicine Strategic Planning Committee. Dr. Raj has spoken nationally on topics such as creating a diverse and inclusive environment in residency and empowering trainees to end sexual harassment. Dr. Raj.
Thank you. I want to start by saying that I'm really awed by all of the other panelists and their willingness to make themselves vulnerable so that we can all learn from this. I also want to thank Dr. Johnson for his comments with regard to the Atlanta killings and the fact that they highlight not just racial violence or racially motivated violence, but also that intersectionality between racism and frank misogyny that these murders really represent. I think, the point is really whether the suspect was motivated by race or by sex addiction. Really what was behind these killings was the objectification and dehumanization of a group of people. In this case, these Asian American women, but they were dehumanized the same way that George Floyd and other victims have been dehumanized. So that's something that we really need to fight against. And if we're going to do that, I think we need to fight against all the destructive stereotypes that exist about people of color and women, in particular women of color. And as an Asian American, I think that the notion of Asian women as being submissive and easily exploitable is not just offensive, but it's personally terrifying. As the mother of an Asian American daughter, we have had discussions around the dinner table, just kind of, talking to her about the racism and that she's experienced at school. And she's only 12, but it's important for her to learn how to stand up for herself and stand up for others when she experiences or witnesses some of these hateful acts. And it really is scary to think that one day she could go out and be victimized, just like any of the women who were killed in Atlanta. So for my own experiences, as a first generation Asian American, I grew up in a small town in upstate New York, and I've dealt with racism all my life. I've never been the target of physical attack, thankfully, but frequently targeted by microaggressions. The most common example, which I'm sure everyone on this panel can relate to, is being asked by my patients where I'm from. So I know that many times is meant as an innocent question, but after about the 1,000th time that I'm asked where I'm from, it feels like a microaggression, because what the patient's really trying to communicate to me, either consciously or unconsciously, is that I'm foreign to them, and somehow I'm not really an American, even after I've told them I'm from New York. So, because I'm so used to it, I think sometimes I deal with it through humor. Ideally, we should all use these incidents as opportunities to educate people, but usually it just feels easier to shrug it off and move on. However, when it happens to our children, when it happens to our learners who are vulnerable and have not necessarily built up the armor that we have, then we definitely have to step in and stand up for them, and also show them how to stand up for themselves. So I've come across a lot of resources online, including some that are endorsed by the AAMC, which provide upstander training. And that's something that I think that we should offer to everyone in the Creighton community, so that we can all be allies and upstanders for each other. I think that the other thing that we can do is, really work hard to create a diverse environment in our faculty, for our residents and our students, because that's really, I think, the best way to break down those destructive stereotypes. that lead to violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Raj. Our next panelist is Dr. Poonam Sharma. Dr. Sharma is Professor and Chair of Pathology, Interim Chair of Radiology at the Creighton University School of Medicine and CHI Health in Omaha, Nebraska. Dr. Sharma. Oops, you're on mute, Poonam.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson and all the panelists. I've been listening to these stories and so profound, and they resonate with me. For example, Jaya mentioned people asking us, where are you from? And it happens so many times, and we try to dismiss it. And typically, the question is, where are you from? And then they would say, wow, your English is very good, or you are very articulate. I've heard it so many times. And I've learned to, not be upset by it and instead try to understand where they are coming from. And often that strategy, trying to understand the things from other person's viewpoint, has helped me deal with this. I would say, just like Jay-Z had mentioned, I have not experienced very aggressive incidents of racism, but microaggressions definitely. And like, I could understand many of the stories that have been told here. So today I want to share with you something that happened very recently in my department, and that's why it's very, very fresh in my mind, and other incidents of microaggression. And this took place between a senior faculty member of a socially privileged class and a student. And the faculty member is supposed to be mentoring the student on a research project. And then this project is going to be presented at a platform in a conference. And as this gentleman was preparing the student, he happened to mention that you should try speaking in English accent. And it was said in a public forum. I was shocked to hear. I was sad and I was shocked, and I really didn't even know how to respond. And the student was asked to watch some English movies so she can speak better, so she could be better understood. I obviously know the person, the student, and while she has accent, so do I, and I know many people around us who have accent. I know she has accent, but she is very well understood, and she speaks well. She's given many presentations. After hearing this, the student was shattered, and she was, visibly disturbed. So I didn't know, as a leader, how do I respond? I was just there, and it happened in an instant, and I was like, okay, what am I supposed to do? But I knew this for sure, that inaction is not an option here. So I talked to the faculty member in privately as soon as I could, and I just said to I said to them that I'm going to talk to you about something, and you're not going to like it, but I have to address it right now with you. So I think he got a hint of what I may be saying, but I just told him that this was inappropriate. You completely, it was disrespectful. You invalidated the student, and it was unnecessary. How do you think he responded? He defended himself by saying that he was only trying to help, and that if her presentation was good, then our department would look good. This is often what we hear from people. And so he tried to dismiss it, downplay it, defended himself by saying that he had good intentions. He actually ended up doing exactly opposite. He made her feel very inadequate, less than, and diminished her courage, telling that she is not good enough. And I know that many of us could relate to this. And these microaggressions are actually seemingly innocuous, but they are deep wounds. They stay with us for a very long time. And yeah, so it was very sad moment. I also felt very, as a leader, I felt like I don't have training in addressing these moments, and they just happen unannounced. I mean, nobody has a warning, and it just happens. So what do you do? How do you find the courage to face it right then and not let it go? Again, inaction is not an option, especially as a leader, as a human being. Not doing anything when you witness such incidents is not an option for any one of us. Whether it happens to somebody I know, somebody from my department, a friend, a stranger at the airport, we simply cannot keep quiet. I encourage you to, if you witness this incident and you happen to be there, provide support, find courage to speak up, and address the situation. I was talking to Dr. Johnson about it, just a day or two ago, and basically there is no way to avoid it. Be short and direct. Be clear in what your message is, and you have to provide support to the person who is experiencing microaggression. So in this particular case, I and myself and a couple of other faculty members, who had witnessed the incidents, they approached her, and we had a very open and honest discussion about it. So yeah, I wish I had a straightforward answer on how to address it when you witness it happening to somebody else, but I think you just have to act. You just have to say it out there and be very clear in your messaging. A zero tolerance policy. I would say you don't have to be aggressive, but firm. And allow another person to speak. But mostly, in my experience, they always try to defend themselves. They have very little insight. So, sometimes I try to view things from their viewpoint also. And in Hindu scripture, there is a phrase, and it's called Tat Tvam Asi, which means that I see others in myself and myself in others. Simply put, trying to understand things from others' viewpoint. And that we are born in different nations, we have different languages, we look different, we have different religions, but we are all humans. God created us all equal. And the only message that we have to give each other is love. That's all. I don't see any other way. I'm very saddened by all the incidences that have happened recently. And my fellow panelists who have experienced the microaggressions and incidents of racism. Thank you, Dr. Johnson, for organizing this town hall and giving us an opportunity to speak up.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma. And thank all the panel members. At this time, I'd like to turn the floor to Dr. Johnson again for a brief discussion of the panel and closing remarks. Dr. Johnson. Oops, you're on mute.
I'm muted. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bartz, for facilitating this as the moderator, and Dean Dunlay for allowing us to gather like this, and all the panelists for your active involvement with this. I guess, I mean, there's so many things, so many jumping off points with the conversations and the stories that I'm just really inspired to hear. But I'm just wondering if you had recommendations or thoughts about how we could move forward with respect to dealing with issues of racism and racial terrorism. What would your recommendations be? I guess I could try to respond to my own question because microaggressions came up so frequently today in several of the conversations. The panelists mentioned this. And so generally, quite frankly, this whole area of microaggressions is not anything that's really new. It's been around for quite a while. The person who actually created this term was a Harvard psychiatrist, Dr. Chester Pierce, who created this, coined the term racial microaggressions, actually just called microaggressions at the time, to describe his experience with his Black patients who were coming in reporting repeated incidents of some kind. So when it comes to like, what do you do under those circumstances, when you're a bystander to those kinds of things, I think the one thing I would always encourage someone to do is to encourage that person, let them know that they're not alone, that that you should never allow anyone to invalidate you. And those are very important things, because when I hear these stories, and I certainly get a lot of stories in the role that I play in the School of Medicine, that's the one thing that I will say to people in direct meetings with them when they're coming forward with these stories about what's occurred to them. So it is difficult sometimes, I know, but do not allow anyone to invalidate you. It takes a lot of bravery to do what you do. Just very quickly, just tell a short story. In a previous life, I used to work with a lot of different law enforcement agencies, and I had a job that I was actually hired by the New York State Police to work with them, and we would travel during Christmas time, usually, to these different trooper stations, and we're screening police applicants. And the only good thing about this job is it paid well, and we got to eat an unlimited budget of food, so we could order and go to the most expensive restaurants. And we always had to work in pairs, because the New York State contract required us, if we're going to disqualify someone, that we had to do a second opinion, and it had to be done on the spot. So we work in pairs. We drive around to the state, to Syracuse, all over the state. And so, but at the end of the day, we were exhausted, tired, frustrated, grumpy, and you're with one other person. So I was usually with one of my other psychology colleagues, and we were at these really nice restaurant, and the waitress came over to take our food order, and my friend, who's not known to be the most gracious person in the world, literally just bit her head off. And I'm going to back up and tell you something. And when we would rate our applicants, we'd rate them on a grading system from A to F. A is excellent, F is obviously flunking. So after he tore the head off of this waitress, I looked at him and said, you know, if I had to give you a rating for that interaction with her, it would be F. And he was like stunned that I would say this. What do you mean? Well, how can I recover from this? I don't know what we can do to recover from it, but we need to give her a really big tip, okay? And so then when she came back, I took the initiative to apologize and said, you know, we've had a rough day. It doesn't excuse what my friend said to you. We want to apologize. And she basically sort of accepted the apology and moved on from that. But then after she left the second time, I said to him, remember one thing, never offend anyone who's serving you food, okay? That's the wisest thing you can do, because it's a big mistake to make mistake. But it's always very difficult, I think, when we get in these situations. And Father, you said something that really struck me, and it's hard to do this and pray for folks like this, but I often pray for people who don't have what you just described as the intrinsic value for the respect of race. and people that are different races. And it's hard to do that for me, but I do it intentionally because I know they're out there. I've seen them, I've heard them. And the hardest thing to do is to pray for those folks because something is intrinsically wrong with their value system if they can't accept and respect people from different races.
Yeah, I want to add one. So, for example, we have recently had this all-inclusive training in our society. Thanks to Tashbir Carl, who recommended this, video where we had an hour and a half, talk by an expert from University of Michigan who gave all the different kinds of, micro aggressions and all those educational stuff. So I think it will be very good to have some kind of training like this. I don't know what kind of scale, but I think it will be very good training.
I recently came across on the, can't remember where, but it was on the MedEd portal, which is the AAMC website, and it's all the workshops and other resources are peer reviewed. There's a workshop and facilitator's guide for a workshop called I Didn't Know What to Say. And I was intrigued, first of all, by the title. And so what this workshop involved was actually a role play between a resident who had experienced an act of racism and basically verbal attacks from a patient on her very first day of internship. And that interaction with the patient was, I guess, reenacted. And then her subsequent interaction with the faculty member who was precepting her that day. And after they reenacted these scenes, they both shared their reflections after the event. I think the faculty member felt some guilt that he didn't know what to say, and he somehow let her down by not stepping in immediately. But I think that's why we need this training so that we get some practice learning how to respond to these incidents, how to stand up for ourselves, how to stand up for others so that it becomes a little bit more second nature. I agree, in the moment, sometimes it's so shocking that you just don't know what to say. And so that's one example of the resources out there, but there are many.
I want to add, again, the feeling of helplessness and the feeling of momentarily being paralyzed when you hear something that is hurtful. And in discussing this and having had experience in sort of working with cultural psychiatry and stigma with trainees, having had difficult conversations when you bring up how you approach a situation from a culturally sensitive lens. I found my starting place to be the guide to allyship. And because I found that word was more powerful than advocate and brought togetherness in a way that didn't fan upset feelings. Just in terms of the definition of an ally in the guide to allyship is take on the struggle as your own, transfer the benefits of your privilege to those who lack it, and amplify the voices of the oppressed. And acknowledge that though you feel pain, the conversation isn't really about you. And stand up, although sometimes we all feel intimidated and scared in that moment. And really sort of, if we're in that position and we've had this conversation, Dr. Johnson's been part of it in our residency where we've talked about implicit bias, and all of us have it. And so just acknowledging that is also really important.
You're on mute, Dr. Johnson.
You're on mute, Dr. Johnson. Sorry, we can't hear you.
So I need to be unmuted permanently.
Yeah.
although I'm sure my wife would disagree with that assessment. I know that this concept of microaggressions has come up frequently. And to let you know, there is a strategy, or it is a technique, there's a whole field that's devoted to looking at things that can be done with respect to microaggressions, and it's called micro-interventions. And basically they are just everyday words or deeds, whether intentional or intentional, that can be communicated to the targets of microaggressions. And I don't want to get into a lot of detail about it, but it's very helpful. It's a recreation of some of the old assertion training, but it's still nonetheless very effective. And so maybe we could think about some ways in which we can do more trainings on those micro interventions. But I don't know if anyone else wants to say anything. Dean, would you like to say anything before we close for the night?
So when we think about the training that we need, that needs to become part of our curriculum, because part of the problem here is, and that came up through most of the panelists, is this feeling of an inability to communicate adequately when something happens, you witness something, you're in a state of shock. What do I do? What do I say? And I think we need to prepare our graduates to be leaders and having those conversations. That's their place in society, to be honest with you, is to be on the edge where there are tough conversations that just have to be had. And we need to really give them the tools they need to be successful in those conversations, because that's how, we demonstrate, faith that does justice. And so I think that I would look for feedback from people on how we really ingrain this into our curriculum, so that we know when people leave Creighton, they're able to be the type of physician leaders and other types of leaders that we want them to be. This was terrific, and I want to thank everybody. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Ron.
Well, are there any final words before we part? I'm just really grateful for this whole panel and the expertise that was brought together very quickly to have this conversation on this very timely and important topic. I want to thank both Dr. Savolas and Dr. Bartz for their fine work behind the scenes to make all of these technical things happen the way that they did, despite the fact that some of us don't know how to unmute ourselves when we talk. So thank you for your attendance, and good evening.
Thank you all. Good night.